Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. But generally, we look at 3 movies from a particular subgenre of horror, exploring them, see what makes them tick. But today, what I'm doing is my Is It Syllabus-Worthy series, where I look at a recommendation from you guys and determine whether or not it's worthy of being on my horror movie syllabus. Today's recommendation is Willy's Wonderland, as you probably saw from the thumbnail or the title. And this one was recommended to me by 2 people, Sarah, friend of the channel, and Fungus Among Us, which is still one of my favorite screen names of all time. Both of them recommended this movie in the horror action video, the subgenre for horror action that we did a few months back. And that gives me a little bit of a hint as to what to expect with the movie. But the truth be told, I kind of knew about this movie before it was even recommended. I knew that Nick Cage was in it, and I knew it had to do with him fighting Chuck E. Cheese style animatronic animals. And that's pretty much all I knew about it. But I knew that it was kind of a hard to categorize film. It was kind of horror, kind of action, kind of comedy. At least that's what I was under the impression. And it had kind of made a bit of a buzz. People had really gravitated towards it. It seemed like it had made a pretty good mark. People seemed to like it quite a bit, as evidenced by the fact that 2 people have recommended it to me here. And it was something I had intended to get to because I do like me some Nick Cage, and even though his movies aren't always quality, I do tend to like him. So I probably was going to check this out anyways, but seeing it get recommended twice on the video, kind of moved it up the watch list a bit, so I'm finally getting to it now. And it's probably worth noting that this movie was supposed to be theatrically released, but due to the pandemic, wound up getting released straight to video. And I don't know that that's necessarily an indictment on the quality of the film. It's just, the circumstances at the time, movies that were coming out in 2020, you kind of have to understand that not everything's getting a theatrical release. But does that mean this movie was good or bad? Well, let's get into this movie and talk about it a little bit. I'll probably tell you what I liked and what I didn't like about the movie, and then we'll wrap up with whether or not I think it's worthy of being on the syllabus. So let's go ahead and take on Willy's Wonderland. Like I said, the movie that we're examining today is Willy's Wonderland. Willy's Wonderland came out in 2021 after some delays caused by the pandemic that stopped the theatrical release from happening and eventually led to the decision of releasing it on home video, direct-to-video, on streaming. And the movie was not only starring Nicolas Cage, but also was produced by him. I guess he got a copy of the script, ran up really liking it, and kind of threw his weight behind it to get it made. He really seemed to gravitate towards this project and seemed to really believe in it. And whether or not his belief was warranted is something we're going to discuss in just a minute. But first, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a drifter, played by Cage, whose car breaks down in this small town. And when he goes to get it fixed, he doesn't have any cash on him to get it fixed. And so he makes a deal to clean up this old restaurant, this family-themed restaurant with animatronic animals in it that's been shut down for a long time and is now in a state of severe disrepair. And if he can stay the night cleaning the whole place up, in the morning, the owner will pay off his debt to get his car fixed and he can be on his way. Unbeknownst to him, it's a trick, and they are sacrificing him to these possessed animatronic animals that are actually infused with the spirits of serial killers that have to be fed so often in order to keep them from terrorizing the town. I'll stop there so as to not spoil it for anybody, but the movie has an admittedly ridiculous premise, and it knows it. It's not trying to hide the fact that it's a silly concept. This is arguably one of the movie's greatest strengths, is its silly premise. It knows that the concept is ridiculous, and it's not shying away from that, but it's playing it straight. And this is something that I was a little surprised by when I watched the movies. I kind of assumed that it was going to be kind of like a horror action comedy, and I guess technically it kind of is, but it's not really leaning into the comedy. It's not playing comedy up. It's funny because the concept is funny, the premise is funny, and Nick Cage is funny, but we'll get into that in a second. But it really is playing this movie as a straight horror action movie. It really isn't trying to make a parody or a silly slapstick type thing. It's really playing it straight to its benefit. This was a nice surprise for me. The movie taking everything seriously, playing it straight, but also knowing what it is and not taking itself too seriously, which almost sounds like a contradiction in terms. It doesn't seem like it would make sense that the movie's not taking itself seriously, but also playing it straight and taking it seriously. But what I mean by that is it's not leaning in to the ridiculousness of its concept. It's giving you a ridiculous concept. It knows it's ridiculous, and then trying to take it as straightforward and as serious as possible. And that's what makes it work. That's what makes it funny and fun, and it really is wringing the most out of what is not just a ridiculous premise, but kind of a thin one too. If we're being honest, the plot is a little bit thin, but we'll dig into that in a minute or so. The movie has, I think it's eight different animatronic characters, or maybe it's six. I don't really remember. But it has all these different animatronic characters. They're all based on a different animal. Like there's a weasel and a turtle and a alligator, and they're really interesting designs. A, because they do feel like animals that you would see in some sort of Chuck E. Cheese style restaurant. But B, because they also at the same time look creepy. They look cute and they look creepy at the same time. And that is another reason why this works for me, because again, it's not shying away from the silliness of these characters, these animatronic characters being the villains, and trying to make them scary at the same time. Like they know that they're cute, funny creatures, but they're also making them very lethal. And they managed to toe that line. They really managed to find that balance and make it work rather well. I was actually pretty pleased and impressed with the animatronic villains. They worked for me quite a bit. Without going into it too much, the animatronic creatures are infused with the spirits of different serial killers, or like a cult of serial killers, and so they each kind of have a little bit of a different personality, but they don't really go too much into the background of the killers. But they did actually flesh this out apparently in a series of comic books, or a comic book series, where they would go into the backgrounds of each of the different characters and explain like what they were like before they had their spirits put into these animatronic creatures. And I haven't read the comic book, so I don't really know much about it. I just saw it when I was doing the research, and that's interesting to me. But it's also kind of one of the knocks I have on the movie is that the plot is thin. They don't give you a lot of backstory. They just kind of say, "Here's the concept. Here's the premise," and they don't really flesh out the events that led to these killers being put into these robot creatures, and B, the town kind of coming to this weird uh, treaty or truce with them. They kind of show a little bit of it in flashbacks. They get like little quick flashbacks of it, and I guess technically that's enough to give you all you need. But it felt like you're taking a premise that's already kind of thin, and you're not even giving me the backstory on it. But this is a minor complaint because it's not what you're here for, and the movie knows it. Once again, the movie knows what it is. It's here to show Nick Cage kicking the crap out of a bunch of robot creatures, and it's going to deliver that in spades. It's not really trying to waste a lot of time giving you a backstory into all of this. It's got it's got things to do, and it wants to get to them pretty quickly, and on that it succeeds. So giving you a backstory in comic book form is not necessarily a bad idea, because if you really care, you can go and read those comic books about it. But if you just want to get to the Nick Cage action, you're going to get to the Nick Cage action. And I think that's good, because Nick Cage is the biggest reason why this movie works. Now, we've talked about Nick Cage a few times on the channel, and I think we will probably talk about him again. And I like Nick Cage. And I'm not like a Nick Cage fan, like a crazy fan, like Pedro Pascal and Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. I just like Nick Cage. And I like him because no matter what he's doing, he gives you everything he's got. He's going to give you a really interesting and energetic and an original, fresh performance, no matter how crappy the movie is. And you may or may not know, Nick Cage has had some severe financial problems in the past, and so he was taking projects basically for the money so he could pay off his debts, and not being terribly selective. But I respect that even if they were bad movies, he was still giving his Nick Cage best at it, and he would always try to do something fresh or original, unique, or at least interesting, if not to everybody, at least to himself, to make the movies feel more than just standard boring dreck. And he's good at that. And I like that about him. I like it a lot, actually. And it makes some of the crappier movies that he's been in not so crappy, or at least a lot more fun to watch. Looking at you, Wicker Man remake. But this movie is not one of those movies. I think that this movie appealed to him because of the ridiculous premise, because of these animatronic characters and how his character would fight them. And I think that gravitated to his kind of weird and quirky sensibilities, and he really committed to this movie. Not only, again, acting in it, but producing it. He really was sold on this movie, and I think he was right to be so, because the movie hinges on Cage versus these animals, and it's fantastic. The fight scenes in this are a blast. Nick Cage is, he's older now. He's not in the shape he used to be in and stuff, but these fights still feel rather convincing, thanks in part to editing, thanks in part to those creature designs, which again I think are suitably creepy enough, and the people in the suits move well enough that the fights feel fun. Ridiculous, but also fun to watch at the same time. And that's a tough balance to achieve, but Cage and company do it really, really well. It's by far the highlight of the movie. And like I said, the movie knows this. The movie is getting you to the Cage fights as quickly as possible without wasting too much time on the rest of the story, other than to give you what you need to be serviced to understand the plot. It's not going to get bogged down too much in plot details. And that's a good thing, because honestly, outside of Cage, who is doing this great job, he's this crazy drifter, violent guy who's doesn't talk at all. And apparently that was Cage's idea, to not talk at all in the movie, and just be like this mysterious drifter who is a badass who can kick ass, and he pounds like sodas. Like, it's a wildly goofy character that you get, again, no backstory on. But outside of Cage's like manic and intense and fun performance, the rest of the cast is serviceable at best, not terribly memorable. There's a cast of kids in there that are kind of fodder for the most part, and then you've got Beth Grant in there playing the sheriff, and I usually like her pretty well, but she feels a little miscast here. She doesn't feel like the right person for this role. Maybe somebody more like a Melissa Leo would have been better. Not that they could have afforded Melissa Leo, but you get the idea. Like, the rest of the cast just is not living up to the energy that Cage is bringing, and their characters are paper thin, so there's not a lot for them to work with anyways. But Cage is doing his Cage thing. He's bringing his A game top notch, and it honestly probably wouldn't work without Cage. It honestly, the movie would probably collapse on itself and just kind of fall flat if it weren't for Cage just kind of carrying it by just whooping on all these different animals, which I guess look a little bit like the Five Nights at Freddy's video game. Like, I don't know Five Nights at Freddy's. I've never played it. I know the concept is like, I guess, animatronic creatures that kill you or something. And apparently that maybe is kind of the inspiration for this movie, or at least part of why I think it was received so well, is that people like Five Nights at Freddy's, and this kind of feels a little bit like that, but with different characters, obviously, for legal reasons, I'm sure. But I don't have any affinity for that at all. I don't know anything about it, so that's not why I was enjoying it. I was enjoying it because I think it was fun to see Cage beat up Chuck E. Cheese, basically. That worked for me really, really well. They sold that to me. They made, again, a thin premise, fun. The movie doesn't overstay its welcome. The movie doesn't get bogged down in details. The movie knows you want to see Cage fighting, and you do, and it generally works. Like I said, the animatronic characters give them a good fight. There's some fun surprises, and it's remarkably violent and a little gory, which you wouldn't expect given the premise, but it is. And I think that's part of why it kind of feels appropriate to put it here, and talk about it in a horror channel, is it does feel a little bit like a horror movie. It's got possession in it, and serial killers, and violence, and some gore, and some blood. And it's all a blast. Again, the movie knows what it is. It's trying to have a good time. It wants you to have a good time with it. And I'd say that it really succeeds at that. I think it really does nail that, despite all of its flaws. And there are, like I said, a few flaws. There's a few things in here that fall short. But despite all that, it still winds up pulling it off. And I had a really good time with it. But did I have a good enough time to put it on my syllabus? Let's find out. So, as usual, the question is it syllabus worthy? And the answer is maybe. Probably, again, as extra credit. And I realize that maybe that seems like it's cheating a little bit. But in this case, it's largely driven by the fact that the movie is hard to categorize. I think horror action probably is the best place to stick this. So I think Sarah and Fungus Among Us were right to put it in that subgenre, because that's probably the best place it fits. you could maybe put it into a possession thing. You can make some arguments for that. You could make it an argument for maybe, like a serial killer, slasher kind of thing. But it doesn't really, it doesn't have a very clear, obvious home. And so when movies are like that, that I want to squeeze on there, it's usually they wind up getting, an extra credit. So as an extra credit for horror action, this probably would make some sense. Syllabus proper, probably not because it's hard to categorize. But uh, despite the flaws, I did really have a fun time with this movie. Like, I have no affinity for Five Nights at Freddy's, but I still found the animatronic characters fun and interesting and really visually a joy to watch and watch them fight. And it really was Nick Cage. Nick Cage really brought this movie home, and that's also maybe why it probably wouldn't squeeze its way onto the syllabus proper, is because without Nick Cage, I don't think I would have really enjoyed this movie very much. I don't think it would have had the reception that it had. I don't think it'd have the following that it has. I think that people would forget about it. It wouldn't have made any waves whatsoever, but for Nick Cage. But it does have Nick Cage, and so that saves the movie for me, and probably for a lot of other people. Frankly, Nick Cage is eminently watchable in this. Look. If you go in watching this movie, go in with just lowered expectations. Just kick back, have a good time. Don't think too hard about it. Don't expect too much from it, and you will have a good time. It's a silly movie, but it takes itself seriously, and it's trying to make sure that you have a good time. So if you let yourself have a good time, you will. If you want to nitpick it, there's plenty to nitpick, but why waste your time doing that? It was not fun. Yes, the movie could have been better, but I think that making it better by giving it a more deep story or some backstory, and even more interesting side characters really would have actually maybe kind of also hurt it and made it worse because, again, it stays laser focused on giving you Cage fighting animals that are robots. And that's really where you want it to stay. So they were wise to do what they did. So honestly, don't make it better. Don't make it better. Leave it exactly the way it is, because the way it exactly is right now works. So that's my thoughts on Willy's Wonderland. If you've seen it, let me know in the comments what you think of it. And I know a few of you have, because a few of you recommended it. But if you haven't seen it, I would say it's worth a watch. Like I was saying, if you're not expecting too much of it, I think it's definitely worth your time. Definitely worth, checking out and getting your own opinion on it. And if you do, of course, go down in the comments, chime in, let me know what you thought of it, because I had a really good time with this one. And now it's time to keep the good times rolling by checking out a horror Trivial Pursuit card. Although whether or not we have a good time will depend on whether or not I can answer it. As you know, I like to read this question without cutting, so you guys know if I cheated or not. And I'm going to go ahead and look at the supernatural category for the card, because, this movie, Willy's Wonderland, has a supernatural aspect to it with these killers, getting put into these animatronic creatures. So, supernatural category it is. And the question is, in 2012's Paranormal Activity 4, Wyatt Nelson is revealed to be what character from 2010's Paranormal Activity 2? And I'm going to luck out on this one. And I'm going to luck out on this one because I just so happen to have revisited Paranormal Activity as a subject. So, as some of you may or may not know, I do enjoy watching a good reaction video. It's fun to relive watching a movie, in particular horror movies, by watching somebody else on YouTube record their own reactions to it. It's almost like you're watching it with them, and they're watching it for the first time. You can kind of re-experience what it was like, for the surprises and the scares that you felt the first time you saw it. And so I do like to watch those videos, especially the ones of older movies, to see how well they hit for a younger audience, things like The Exorcist, stuff like that. But I was recently watching somebody watch the Paranormal Activity series, which I haven't watched in a while. We talked about it on the channel, and I like the movies, but I think they do get progressively weaker as they go on. And this girl was watching the movies, and so as a result, it's fairly. I was watching this like a couple weeks ago, so it's fairly fresh in my mind, the series and the names of the characters, because aside from Katie and Mika, who I remember from the first movie pretty well, Katie Featherston and Mika Sloan, because I just remember those names. I saw that movie a lot. I wouldn't have remembered any of the other characters' names, because as you know, I don't remember characters' names well at all. But because I just watched this fairly recently, like not even 2 weeks ago, I know the answer to this question. I'm like 99% sure I know the answer to this question. And if you guys are big fans of the Paranormal Activity series, you probably know this too. But I am going to give you a chance. Oh, I think I've given you a chance to think about this. I've prattled on a little bit here. So if you got your answer locked in, because I'm going to make my guess now. And my guess is Hunter. The character Hunter, the baby Hunter from Paranormal Activity 2, is revealed to be the boy in Paranormal Activity 4. And I would not have remembered that at all 3 weeks ago. But 2 weeks ago, I got my memory refreshed. So I'm fairly confident in this. So let's go ahead and see what the card says. And the answer is Hunter Ray. Hunter, yes, I am correct. And I'm feeling very fortunate because it's pure dumb luck. I don't read these questions in advance. I read them. First time I'm seeing them is when you're seeing me read them on camera, and I just by chance happened to have watched this. So hopefully you guys got it right too. And if you didn't, what did you guess? Because you know I like me some silly bad answers. So let me know in the comments below if you got a silly bad answer. But hope you had fun with this question. I hope you had fun with Willy's Wonderland. And again, check it out if you haven't seen it. Let me know what you think. Next week we'll be back with something completely different. But until then, class dismissed.